So today we're going to be talking about photosynthesis. Most of you have a good idea of what photosynthesis is. Okay? Photosynthesis is the conversion of the light energy into chemical energy. So the plant will take the light energy from the sun and it will convert it into chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates or sugars, most commonly in the form of glucose. So converting that into chemical energy, so then later or other organisms, as well as the organism that did photosynthesis, can convert that chemical energy into usable energy, do cellular respiration and convert it into ATP. So photosynthesis is the source of all energy in the food chain, okay, in ecosystems. All the energy that is harnessed within that system is due to the process of photosynthesis. Okay, so it occurs mostly in plants, although we have some algae that can do this, which are not a plant, actually. Algae are what are considered a protist. Okay, and then there are some bacteria that are able to do versions of photosynthesis, not in the chloroplast per se, but are able to do a very similar process. So in the plants, photosynthesis is occurring in the chloroplast. And if you remember, that chloroplast is green. Remember, chlor means green? And that chloroplast is green because it contains the pigment chlorophyll. So let's talk a little bit about how that chloroplast is able to harness that light energy and bring it into the plant. So the light is released from the sun in the form of photons. Photons are like little pockets of energy. Little pockets of light energy, almost think of like little light raindrops. Okay, so the photons travel down from the sun, and they're going to be absorbed by pigments. Remember, pigment was one of our vocabulary words. Pigment means that it's a dye. Okay, it's something that determines color, and it determines color based on the light energy that's either absorbed or the light energy that is reflected. Okay, so the color is going to be based upon the light energy that is reflected. We see what is reflected or bounces back from the pigment. The light energy that is absorbed, we do not see because it's absorbed into the pigment. And that actually is the light energy that the plant is going to use. Okay, so for example, you can see here in front of us we have the spectrum, the visible light spectrum. Again, that was one of our vocabulary words, this range of objects, the spectrum. And plants usually appear green, which means they reflect wavelengths of light really kind of between 500 and 600, and they absorb wavelengths of light in the purple range, about 400 nanometers, in the red ranges, about 700 nanometers. That's actually the light they absorb, and their plant is going to end up using the light energy that absorbs. We see what is reflected. What is absorbed by the pigment in the case of photosynthesis is what is actually going to be used. So when we look at this graph here, this graph is a graph of what we call the absorption spectrum. And so we can see here that the amount of light absorbed is here on our y-axis, and we can see here that it peaks in these areas of red, purples, blues. You can see there are two kinds of chlorophyll. Okay, so there are two kinds of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Both of them absorb light, but they absorb light in that 400, 500 range. Plants also have a pigment called carotenoids. Those are what usually gives plants their red color. Okay, they also have a variety of other pigments. For instance, that gives it more of its red color would be xanthophylls. They'll give it more of the red color, those pigments. But these pigments, again, are all about the light they absorb. So the plant looks green because the plant actually doesn't use the green wavelengths of light. Okay? The plant is using all those other wavelengths. But so it's looking green because we see what is reflected back at us. So this absorption of light occurs on the chlorophyll pigment. So chlorophyll is the pigment that's absorbing the light, and the organelle is going to be the actual chloroplast. And so the chloroplast is going to contain this chlorophyll pigment. Okay, so this whole thing here is a chloroplast. And the chloroplast has a couple of different parts that you guys are going to have to be familiar with. The first one being a thylakoid. Okay, a thylakoid is one of these stacks. If you remember when we did the mitochondria, when we talked mitochondria structure and it had that inner membrane, okay, the chloroplast has the same similar structure. It has inner membranes that separate the different spaces so that these processes can occur. And so the thylakoid is one of these inner membrane discs. A granum, okay, plural of that is a grana, so a lot of times you'll see or hear grana, is one of these big stacks of thylakoids. So a grana is made up of, a granum, one of them, is made up of multiple thylakoids, like a roll of coins, where each coin is the thylakoid, and then the whole roll of coins is an example of a granum. Also in the chloroplast is the stroma. So the stroma is all of this space here, almost like cytoplasm for a chloroplast. It's a liquid-based portion that surrounds all of those membrane-based thylakoids. So again, the thylakoid is the individual disc, the grana is the stack of thylakoids, and the liquid part around that is the stroma. So the overall process of photosynthesis, okay, is the fact that we've got carbon dioxide plus water, give it some light, and that's going to give us glucose and oxygen. Okay, that's our overall basis of photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide plus water, okay, with light will give us glucose and oxygen. If you compare this to cellular respiration, okay, cellular respiration was glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide plus water plus approximately 36 ATP. So you'll notice when you compare these, my products of photosynthesis are my reactants of respiration. So these two things go hand in hand. They are basically cyclical. Okay, so we're going to break photosynthesis down into its different parts and look at exactly where each one of these reactants comes into play and products. And photosynthesis has two steps to it. It has the light reaction and then the Calvin cycle. So the light reaction of photosynthesis, this is going to occur on the thylakoid membrane. So in those stacks of grana, okay, on each of those individual thylakoid membranes is where this light reaction is going to occur. And this is, remember our overall equation of carbon dioxide plus water with light is going to give us glucose and oxygen. This is where the water, okay, and the oxygen come about here. Okay, so with the light reaction, light comes in, obviously light comes in, water is taken in, and water is split. Okay, so water is split by the photon, by the light energy. So when that water is split, it's going to be split into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so the water gets split into hydrogen and oxygen. And so the oxygen is going to be released from the plant. So the oxygen is released through what are called stoma, and we'll take a look at those. Take a look at a picture of those in just a second. So the oxygen is released from the plant through the stoma. The hydrogen is going to go to the stroma, and it's going to go to the stroma with one of those electron carrier molecules, very similar to to what we said with cellular respiration with those NADHs and FADH2s. So let's take a look at the stoma, and then we'll take a closer look at where that hydrogen went. So the stoma that release that oxygen, and that's actually where the carbon dioxide comes in. They are a whole. Okay, so you guys are going to have to separate in your head stoma and stroma. And the stoma is this little hole right here. It's the actual hole. It's surrounded by these guys here, which are called guard cells. And they regulate whether that hole is open or closed. So the guard cells are like two kidney beans. Okay, and so, kidney beans are shaped like this. And so they have a hole right here in the middle of them. And that is that stoma, which is the hole. Okay, and then these guard cells are right here on either side of it. And we'll talk more about the guard cells when we talk about water leaving a plant. But all I want you right now is to be aware that they exist and that they're what control whether that hole is open or not. So they control whether oxygen is able to leave the plant as well as whether carbon dioxide is able to get into the plant. Because the stoma is this little hole where oxygen leaves, water leaves. When it's hot outside and the plant is wilting because the water's being pulled out of the plant through transpiration, it goes out through those holes in the stoma. But it is also where CO2 will enter the plant. So that's how the plant's going to receive its carbon. Okay, so in the light reaction that has occurred, the photon has traveled down. It's been absorbed by the chlorophyll, okay, those higher and lower wavelengths of light, not the green. So that photon was absorbed by the chlorophyll. That energy from the light from the photon was used to split the water. The water's been split now into hydrogen and oxygen, and that oxygen leaves. The plant doesn't need that oxygen anymore. It leaves the plant out through the stoma. That hydrogen, we said, goes over to the grana. So let's take a look at what that's going to be like. Okay, so remember, I'm an excellent artist. So here's our chloroplast. Okay, here's our sun. There's our sun up here. Right, so its light energy comes down in the form of photons, and it strikes the thylakoid membrane. Remember, the whole stack here is my grana. Each individual one is a thylakoid. So the light energy strikes the thylakoid membrane, and remember, this causes my water to split. So I have oxygen leaves through the stoma. And hydrogen is going to travel over to what is called the Calvin cycle. Just like in cellular respiration, where we had electrons that had to travel somewhere, they need a ride. We need an electron acceptor or an electron carrier that will give it a ride. Just like we had that NADH that picked up the hydrogen, which was the electron, took it to the electron transport chain. The FADH2s, we have one for photosynthesis as well. It's called NADPH. So we have this NADPH. Okay, the P does not actually stand for photosynthesis, but that's how you can separate which one's for photosynthesis and which one is for respiration. NADPH with a P is for photosynthesis. NADH is going to be with cellular respiration. So that hydrogen now is right here. It caught a ride on this NADPH. If you think back to our original equation, NADPH was not anywhere in our original equation. And that's because this molecule is constantly recycled. Once it's a shuttle bus. Once it drops that hydrogen off, it comes right back to pick up some more. It is ready to pick up another hydrogen. So it's not a reactant, it's not a product. It doesn't really go in and out. It just keeps cycling back and forth. So the hydrogen now is headed over on this electron carrier along with some ATP, okay, along with some ATP over to the Calvin cycle. That right there is our light reaction. The water splitting, the oxygen leaving through the stoma, the hydrogen getting picked up by the NADP, now the NADPH, okay, and hitching a ride over there, over to the Calvin cycle with some ATP. So now let's look at the Calvin cycle, which is the second step in photosynthesis. So the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma. Remember that liquid portion of the chloroplast. Okay, this is where. Okay, so back to our original equation. We've already used water as a reactant, and we've already produced oxygen, right? We did these during the light reaction. We used the water, we used the oxygen. So what we have left now is carbon dioxide and glucose. And so in the Calvin cycle, this is where the carbon dioxide is going to be required. And if you remember, the carbon dioxide is going to enter through those stoma. Remember those holes in the bottom of a leaf. Okay, those stoma are located on the bottom or the underside of the leaves. Okay, and so that carbon dioxide will enter through the stoma. And then our product here is going to be glucose. Okay, and that glucose is our product that is then going to be used for cellular respiration to make lots and lots of ATP for the plant or either for the consumer that eats the plant. Either way, this glucose product is going to be used to fuel cellular respiration in the mitochondria. So now if we come back to this is our light reaction that we've already talked about. Now let's add in our Calvin cycle to this. So in our Calvin cycle, here comes my CO2 through the stoma. So again, this is a gas. It's coming in through the stoma. Okay, and here's my hydrogen. So now I've got hydrogen being dropped off at the Calvin cycle, right? I've got carbon, I've got oxygen. I have what I need to produce glucose, which is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, and so that's going to be my final product. That's going to require a little bit of ATP to make this Calvin cycle turn, and so that's why we brought some ATP over here from the light reaction. ATP is recycled as well. We break the phosphate off, okay, and ATP, remember ATP is a modified nucleotide, right? So it's got its sugar, it's a modified nitrogen base, right? And then it has 3 phosphates on the end of it. Sorry, this is having trouble getting this to come out well. So it's our nitrogen base, adenine, and then it has 3 phosphates on it. And so this portion right here, these 2 phosphates, they always stay intact. The 2-phosphate is ADP, diphosphate, which is 2, and it's and when we make ATP, all we do when we do cellular respiration, we make ATP is we add this 3rd phosphate on to make it into ATP. When we use the energy, we break this phosphate off and it goes back to being ADP. So it just goes back and forth between ADP and ATP. So again, why that's not a reactant or product? Because it is recycled. So our end situation here with photosynthesis is that I had, let me try to get a totally different color here. Let's use purple. Okay, so I have my reactants, which is my water, and my carbon dioxide went in, right? I mixed it with some light, and the things that actually came out were oxygen and glucose. And the little nitpicky details in between, you just got to spend some time with. The difference between the light reaction, the Calvin cycle, the different parts of the chloroplast. And we'll work with those in class with some diagrams in your notebook. We'll draw some of this stuff, and we will do a lab over photosynthesis.